I think post 9/11, what happened was I realized that there was all of a sudden a lot of narrative in the media, a lot of narrative in popular culture starting to happen without the voices of the people involved. So people were creating perceptions and building a narrative about what it meant to be a Muslim or what it meant to be a British Muslim. And I realized that if I didn't own my identity or start claiming that narrative as my own, I would be almost perpetuating the challenge that I could see happening.
Hi, my name is Nadia Nagamutu, business psychologist, coach, speaker, and founder of Avenir Consulting, which creates organisational growth and success via inclusion and diversity. We've been discussing the benefits that diversity brings to companies' bottom line performance for decades with more and more evidence. But there are so many questions organisations still have about how to achieve it. How do you create a culture where people feel valued for their uniqueness and the qualities they bring? I believe it's crucial to the future success and sustainability of every organisation that they find the answer to this question to make sure that each employee is not only supported but also appreciated. With this podcast, I aim to get some of the key challenges to creating inclusive workplaces out in the open and start uncovering the solutions to embracing a culture that cares for everyone. I'm going to be having conversations with some of the most inspiring people in different countries and across industries who are pushing the boundaries on inclusion and diversity in the workplace, from topics such as parenting in the workplace, ethnicity, age, gender, mental health, and all things inclusion. I want to create a movement to change society through sharing life experiences and creating more empathy and connection. Why care? I believe that once we have organisations and societies that accept and value everyone for who they are, we become healthier, happier, and better in our roles, both inside and outside work. Hello, and welcome to episode 17 of my Why Care podcast. My name is Nadia Nagamutu, and I am your host. In this episode, I learn from the brilliant Rukasana Bhaijee, who's currently leading the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda across Google's EMEA Technology business. Rukasana shares with us her impressive career path, covering multiple industries and sectors, and working with the government and corporates to develop DEI strategy and build inclusive leadership practices whilst she was at EY. In 2019, she was listed as an inspirational D&I leader and highly commended as an inspirational role model at the European Diversity Awards. Rukasana shares her experience of microaggressions, prejudice, and overt discrimination based on her gender, faith, and the clothes that she wears. She also offers some best-in-class DEI initiatives and programs of work with insights into Google. It's clear that one of Rukasana's deep values is to push boundaries and challenge. Inspirational is absolutely what she is. Enjoy the episode. Rukasana, oh my goodness, I have been wanting to have you on the show for some time. I've stalked you a little bit, I appreciate, but it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you for saying yes.
Thank you, Nadia, for having me. It's a pleasure to reconnect after a while.
It has. It's been quite a while, and sort of came into EY. That's when we first met, wasn't it? And then our paths crossed when I was doing Equal Lives as well.
Yes, that's right. And that workshop was great that you delivered at EY. And yet I remember the launch of a research that you did. That was quite a cool event as well. And it was great to see the discussion move to working parents versus working mums.
And we're getting there. I really do feel like that language in the conversation has moved since I first started working in the area of active fathering and male caring in general. And I'm keen to hear, just as by way of introduction, because I actually don't know your full kind of career history or how you ended up in diversity and inclusion. I'd just be interested in that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share. And it was a journey, I will say, because I actually grew up in the world of banking. I grew up in the very formal world of the Bank of England, straight after A-levels. So straight from A-levels, straight into the world of work at the Bank of England. At one point, I was one of only 2 women on the trading room floor at the Bank of England. So I guess that's where I got my first taste of being the only.
Yeah.
I moved then from the Bank of England to JP Morgan, spent the next 5 years still in a similar field. And then I took some time out. I took a break to be a mum. So from the official corporate world of work, I took almost 10 years out and reskilled as a complementary therapist.
Oh my goodness, I just didn't know that.
So something completely different. I did massage therapy. I worked in a lovely spa on the South Bank at the Marriott. So completely different. I got a Saturday job working in a spa. So I was still very much full-time mum. And I was working in the evenings running a social enterprise, providing massage services mostly to the East London Asian women community, because it was an area I was passionate about, providing that service and bringing the benefits of complementary therapy to the Asian community, which historically they maybe hadn't seen the value of in terms of healing properties. So that was something I was passionate about doing in the evenings. And then once my second son started school, I had been craving the corporate world. So I somehow fell into the world of HR. I'm not going to lie, it was kind of an accident at Queen Mary University. Once I fell into that world of HR, I loved it. And then I reskilled again, become a HR professional.
Yeah.
I studied equality and diversity and coaching at that point. And it's there that I realized a culmination of all my prior experiences from my first and second career, and all the things that I'd noticed and lived in terms of experiences of inequality, and even going as far back as childhood to being a curious child, questioning gender equality whilst growing up and challenging cultural South Asian norms within my own family that we were continuing and perpetuating. I realized kind of when I fell into the world of HR that this was an opportunity to do some meaningful work. And it was an area I was really passionate about. So I was naturally falling into supporting diversity work within the HR team at Queen Mary University, and was lucky enough to apply for a role there. And that was the start of my D&I journey, which was now almost 10 years ago as well.
Incredible. And then from there to EY.
Yes, from Queen Mary University, again, that hankering for the real corporate world that I'd left in JP Morgan was calling me back. So from there, I moved to EY and spent 5 amazing years at EY. It's a great organization, great culture. I had an absolute blast. And there I worked for 3 years as a D&I practitioner, supporting the UK and Ireland business and working with UK and Ireland business leads to support the organization on its journey to build a diverse workforce and foster an inclusive culture, both hand in hand. And that was amazing. I then spent my last couple of years within the people advisory services. So essentially supporting EY's clients to help them to build diverse and inclusive organizations. So it was a real vast experience.
What a buzz. Oh my goodness.
It was.
That's brilliant. So you're now at Google, and we're going to come on to Google in a moment, as I'm sure you've got lots you can share and offer with regards to some of the work that you're doing right now, and obviously drawing back on stuff that you did at EY too. But I'm drawn to that, you as a younger woman or young girl, even at that point where you were growing up and looking at some of the cultural norms around you. And you mentioned about challenging them, which resonated with me because I'm first generation UK born. Is that the same for you?
Yeah, I'm also first generation. My parents immigrated here from India in the 60s.
For me, there was that real internal dilemma, or I was trying to make sense of it, I think, as a young age, of all of this culture, this deeply embedded Mauritian culture that in my household that I was living in, and seeing the gender norms play out between my parents, which I still do today. You know, it's still deeply embedded in their relationship in terms of what my dad does, what my mum does. But living and growing up in a different society to the one they grew up in, and seeing all of that difference in terms of how other people's parents, my friends' parents' roles played out. And what happened for me was very much like almost like a retaliation or a pushing back and a real questioning of whether my parents' relationship, I suppose, was what I wanted or what I thought was right. When you're talking about, I suppose, challenging South Asian cultural norms, you mentioned, what did you mean by that?
Yeah. Everything that you've just said in terms of parental roles or roles in a family household, who does what, who's doing the washing up, who's doing the cooking, who's expected, like what are the unsaid or unwritten rules. In the same way that we have lots of unwritten rules in organizations, we have them in our homes as well. And it was the unwritten rules that I was questioning, like I'm one of 6 children, 4 sisters, 2 brothers. And it was questioning, well, why do my brothers not do the washing up? Why are they not picking up their plates? Why are they not cooking? Why do I need to learn how to cook, but they don't? And if I was, even playing with friends, why am I being told not to have friends who are boys? Or why can't my friends be boys? Why can't I wear certain clothing? Or why can't I play football? I want to play football. So I think it was challenging everything, but also at the same time being really aware of my South Asianness standing out and not being part of the norm. As you say, it was almost like toggling two worlds or two operating systems. So it literally was operating like an Apple OS and an Android.
I love that analogy.
I think actually on reflection, it's been a challenge, but it's also been a benefit because we've learned how to navigate different spaces and go from one norm to another and move within worlds. But it was jarring at the time because you're not seeing anybody like you on TV. So when I grew up, early 80s, there was nobody that looked like me on TV. If there was a program on TV with Asians in, we would all jump up and any sign of Indianness on the TV was celebrated, even if it was perpetuating racist stereotypes. Like a particular program in the UK we had was called Mind Your Language, and it really was perpetuating. Now, if I look back on it, I don't think it will stand the test of time. But those things, like there's nobody like me on TV, there's not many kids like me in popular culture, or when I'm wearing South Asian clothing, people stare at me. And all of a sudden, there was a shift in the late 80s, early 90s, where, there was a lot of cultural appropriation. People like Madonna were starting to wear henna and Asian-inspired or Indian-inspired clothing with sequins on. And all of a sudden, it was like, oh, is it cool now to be Indian? But actually, what I quickly realized and still realize to this day is there are different expectations. So it's okay when somebody like a celebrity is wearing henna, it's like cool, oh, it's a henna tattoo. But on me, it's all of a sudden, oh, it's quite exotic. So there are definitely still assumptions made based on what your skin color is or what you look like.
It's funny, isn't it? It's just because as I was growing up in the UK, I was almost pushing back against the sort of, the Bollywood kind of movies. I didn't want to watch them, wasn't interested in them because it wasn't, to me, it was, I must have got some messages around that it wasn't cool, that wasn't what my friends were watching. And so for me, I just didn't want to embrace that at all. I wanted to disassociate. It's an interesting one with that sort of that dual membership of cultures and how they meet. And as a young person, how to navigate that. It can be incredibly challenging. I'm interested because you mentioned clothing and the South Asian cultural clothing that you wear. And you said it as you were growing up, obviously, as people were looking at you. But do you still find that now? Has anything shifted? You wear a hijab. I know that there are certain biases, and I'd love for you to educate me a little bit more about your experience.
Yeah, that is just an interesting one because, there's been so many different stages of identity, I guess. Growing up, I did identify, if you ask me my identity, I would say I'm Indian and I live in the UK. So I was definitely a British Asian. And even my South Asian clothing, so the traditional shalwar kameez, which is like a long tunic and trousers, I stopped wearing at the age of 17, 18 because I was so keen to integrate and fit in.
Yes.
And I was so concerned with fitting in that I stopped wearing it in public places. Public meaning I wouldn't wear it to the workplace. I wouldn't wear it at the weekend if I was going to white spaces.
Yeah.
I would only wear it if I was going out for dinner to an Indian restaurant or to a wedding. So that became the times when I wore my Indian clothing. And it's taken me a long time to reclaim that part of my identity and the Indianness. And it was only a couple of years ago, an evening event at EY. Mm-hmm. It was a traditional black tie event. And at these things, I usually wear a ball gown, an evening dress. And I actually thought, no, I'm going to wear some Asian couture, like an Indian shalwar kameez with lots of bling on it. And I'm going to be me, fully me. And that felt like a celebratory moment for me because it's at a much older age that I'm fully comfortable in my own skin. And as you mentioned, I now wear the hijab. So I started wearing the hijab in my late 20s, so post 9/11. And again, this was an attempt at the time to reclaim my Muslimness, because
Right.
my Muslimness is something that I always had growing up, but I wasn't a visible Muslim. So even in the workplace at the Bank of England or JP Morgan, people would know that I would not eat pork, for instance, or if we were going out at lunchtime, I would not be partaking in any drink. So they knew I was avoiding alcohol. And even that felt like something I needed to educate them at the time, because it was bizarre. And there was, in the banking culture, it was challenging actually, with people wanting to force drink onto me. That was a horrible experience. And I think post 9/11, what happened was I realized that there was all of a sudden a lot of narrative in the media, a lot of narrative in popular culture starting to happen without the voices of the people involved. So people were creating perceptions and building a narrative about what it meant to be a Muslim or what it meant to be a British Muslim. And I realized that if I didn't own my identity or start claiming that narrative as my own, I would be almost perpetuating the challenge that I could see happening, and which has continued to happen. So as you've already mentioned, there are consequences of wearing the hijab and being a visible Muslim. There are perceptions perpetuated by the media narrative, perpetuated by folks that haven't read about why women wear the hijab or what the hijab is. That means that when women want to enter the workplace in places like the UK, for instance, they may end up facing a triple penalty: the penalty of being a Muslim, the penalty of being potentially from a different racial background, and also being a woman.
Yeah.
So it's almost, instead of facing the glass ceiling, you're facing a triple glazed or a concrete ceiling, which is almost impossible to penetrate. So there are definitely challenges that come with the decision that I've personally made to have my voice matter.
Yeah. And so have you got like an example of some bias that has played out for you that you believe is as a result of your hijab or your clothing or your sort of outward appearance?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A plethora of microaggressions and moments of inequity. So I mentioned when I had my kids, I reskilled and got a job as a complementary therapist, a Saturday job. To get that Saturday job as a therapist, I had to go through 21 interviews in many different places, in different organizations, not in that same organization. And so people were calling me based on my resume, was I had the right qualifications to be a therapist. So I was being called to interviews. But as soon as I entered a space, the visible response from some folks was one of shock. And I guess when you close your eyes and you picture beauty therapist or complementary therapist, an short Asian woman in a hijab, that maybe doesn't come to mind straight away. So even before people would ask me to trial and deliver a massage, they would see me, and pretty much within the first less than 5 minutes, within the first minute of a conversation, I would know that this wasn't going anywhere and I wasn't getting that particular Saturday job. So it was then that I really realized, okay, previously as a South Asian woman, I experienced otherness. I experienced maybe even curiosity in some cases, discrimination in some, but now I felt like an outsider in a completely different way. So my first experiences of getting a job as a visible Muslim was one of, this is going to be a challenge wherever place I'm going to, whatever sector I'm going to be in. So it was a real wake-up call for me, and it's one where I did persevere, and on that 21st interview managed to secure a Saturday job, which was like probably one of the biggest achievements of my life, even though it was for minimum wage, etc. It was definitely an achievement.
It is an achievement, but on many levels, what I've heard you just say there is that when you think of a beauty therapist, you don't picture someone who looks like me. And it seems to be that's a theme in your life in terms of looking at the world around you, not seeing people who look like you, and yet pushing the boundaries and going, yeah, but that's what I want to be, and that's who I am, and I can be the first. I can be the one of the very few. And persisting through 21 interviews, I mean, to get a Saturday job, to do something that you're qualified for, the barriers are systemic, aren't they? Because when I'm hearing that, I'm thinking it's not simply the bias and the prejudice that lies with the person who's interviewing you, but actually what's going on in their mind around, well, if you've got customers, well, you would have as a therapist, they have to preempt what the customers and how the customers might feel about being served by someone, a woman in a hijab or an Asian woman. And so that's the issue, isn't it? Is that you might get someone who is open-minded, but then they're thinking about their business. They're thinking about the world around them and how forward-thinking the world is. It's a massive thing to try and shift.
Yeah, it was every single conversation that I had with every single individual, I treated as an opportunity to shift those preconceptions, because it's preconceptions, it's assumptions that are holding those people back from opening their mind to difference. One, because they don't understand or they're not taking the time to understand. And once someone talks to a Muslim woman, they'll realize that they have aspirations, they have dreams, they are intelligent. Not each of them will be the same. We're not a cookie cutter line of similar individuals with similar thoughts, feelings, ideas. We have different ways to practice our faith. So there's no one cookie cutter approach to being a Muslim woman. I've definitely seen that persisting, and my experiences pre and post hijab and my Muslimness has no doubt impacted the systemic challenges that you mentioned, the access to opportunities. So even the gatekeepers to opportunities, preconceptions of those gatekeepers to opportunities, I know have, even from my move to EY to Google, for instance, at the time when I started looking, one of my colleagues, also a D&I practitioner, would hand recruiters my name. I would tell people, oh, get in touch with my good friend. She's here. She's done this. She's done this. She would pass my name on, and nobody would contact me. So even those, it was such an interesting, and we kept saying at the time, well, we need to write an article about this, because she would pass my name to recruiters from different organizations who just didn't get in touch. And she was like, it's clearly obvious. They've got in touch with me, a white woman. I've given them your name. They've probably looked at your profile and thought, nah, she's not what we picture. Or can we sell her to the client? So it's those things like that, and walking into a room and knowing that I'm going to have to work harder to build my credibility, or my credibility might be questioned if I speak, or it won't be heard in the same way, or I might have to make my point that little bit harder. And as women, I think we have to do all this anyway. We have to speak in a different way, or we know that we'll have to speak with credibility, or may get mansplained a few minutes later. But I think adding on the hijab definitely added that layer of, okay, how am I going to get my voice heard? Because in some spaces, I know I will be othered in terms of attitudes, time, the energy, the airspace that I might get. So it's definitely one of systemic challenges in terms of individual biases perpetuating systemic processes, but also systemic processes keeping somebody like me from out of the gates completely.
Oh my goodness. So the work that we do, both of us, any sort of diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner is striving for, is to create that sort of cultural, societal shift at that deep systemic level. And I know ownership should be at that deeper societal level to shift the system, rather than focus on the people who are from minority groups or underrepresented groups. When I listen to you, I hear this perspective, this shift in framing of it, which is seeing it as an opportunity and stepping into your identity and owning your identity. And I hear courage, I suppose, when I'm listening to you, knowing the barriers, knowing the bias, knowing the discrimination that you could face, but yet still owning your identity. Do you have any advice for people, I suppose, from minority groups who are constantly being subjected to these microaggressions or subtle acts of exclusion each day?
I think one, know your own limits in terms of what you can manage and handle. So knowing self and not being afraid to lead authentically. So if you're safe to do so, if you're in a safe space, always lead authentically and not have to bend your own values or needs. So being true to your own values would be something I would always say. And in the last year, I will say, with the shift in the focus on race equity in organizations and the definite rise after George Floyd's murder of race equity getting onto the agenda in a way that it hasn't before, I would encourage individuals to demand more of their organizations. And I saw an article on this recently where somebody didn't take a role when they were offered because they'd faced inequity, they hadn't been valued at the organization for who they were, and then they decided to go somewhere where they would be valued. So if you're not getting what you need, or if your demands aren't being heard, talent at the moment is being valued elsewhere. So don't be afraid to look elsewhere and go to where your values, your purpose will be welcomed with open arms. So I think personal safety, personal sanity, look after yourself first. But in terms of organizations, I think organizations are dealing with a reckoning at the moment as well, post the race equity movement. And now 1 year on, they hopefully are all reflecting and thinking, what can we do? What have we done? What have we achieved? And what do we need to do in organizations to tackle societal race inequity, faith inequity, whatever the inequity might be? And I would always say to organizations, start by building a culture of belonging for all. So do all the individuals at your organization feel like they belong and can perform to their best ability? What's hindering them? Because if they're experiencing a culture where they're not feeling valued or heard, there's no point in having an organization filled with individuals who are from different genders, different racial backgrounds, different experiences, all forms of diversity. If they're not feeling welcomed, if they're not feeling valued or heard, how can you create that culture of belonging for all and get the basics right? Because if you don't get the basics right, then that's definitely a challenge as well.
Yeah. So we can't speak and not speak about Google. Google is obviously in the tech industry. You've worked in other industries, banking industry, and of course, professional services at EY. So what do you feel now that you've been at Google for some time, working in the D&I space? What is distinct in terms of some of those challenges across those industries based on your experience?
Yeah, and it's always, and I felt the same thing, I think, when I moved from Queen Mary doing D&I work into professional services, and now having moved to Google, I'm also reflecting that the challenges are actually quite similar. The overarching challenge, I think, in terms of representation of women, that's very similar at Google to professional services or the tech industry overall. It's perhaps more perpetuated by who's taking STEM subjects in terms of university or computer science as a profession, and that's across the world. We've seen a dip in the number of women pursuing tech as a career, whereas historically, and many popular films like Hidden Figures have brought to light, actually there were many different individuals like Grace Hopper, like Katherine Johnson at the start of the tech age. It was women that were spearheading, that were leading the charge on these new computers. So moving from human computers to the computers that were being created and coding. And then when the people with power, potentially men, realized that this was an industry that would be valued and not like being a secretary, how can we reclaim that space? So I think over time, tech has faced a particular challenge where women were essentially pushed out of the in-group. I've been reading a lot about this, obviously moving into Google. It was definitely an area where it did feel like a pushing out of women talent, and then perpetuated by media perceptions of what it means to be in tech or what it means to participate in tech culture. So picture now, what does it look like to be in tech? You might picture someone that looks like a white man in t-shirt and jeans, a Mark Zuckerberg. You might picture parties, late night coding, pizzas. The start of the bro culture was perpetuated by media narratives, by organizations that could have done things differently at a time to welcome difference into tech, and the rise in computer science, the women studying computer science then started to take a dip. So I think that particular challenge in tech has been perpetuated just in the last 30 years or so. That's something that's still there in terms of we're pushing against that. We're pushing for more women representation across tech. We're pushing for more transparency. And that's something that's definitely been there for many years across somewhere like professional services, finance industry as a whole, many other sectors. We've been pushing for women representation over a number of time. And that challenge is very similar now in tech to what it was in professional services, to what it was in academia when I was in academia. So the women representation challenge is one, and specifically women in leadership positions. So why is there a leaky pipeline at a particular level? Why is it that we're losing women and not seeing more women in leadership positions? And we did some research at EY, and it wasn't a motherhood penalty, for instance. It wasn't that women were leaving to become mums per se. It was a whole plethora of a number of reasons, and there was no easy answer, or there was no one single answer or a single story. And like with much of D&I work, similar in tech, there's no single story, there's no single initiative or silver bullet that's going to make that difference. But it will make a difference when we start to, I believe, continue to be transparent about progress that's being made, continue to be transparent about intention. What is the intention of the organization? So for me specifically, what's the intention at Google? And I think we've done a good job of that this year with our diversity annual report, which is available for anyone to look at online. We're being quite vocal about progress being slow, but we know that we're in it for the long term. This isn't something that we're going to solve with a magic wand overnight, but we have that intention to do better, be better, and continue to push for change. So that's something that I've been really proud to be a part of that journey in tech.
What example do you have of some initiative that is pushing the boundaries to try and get that shift, particularly from a gender perspective?
One of the things I was about to mention was something that I've been so impressed by, and I haven't seen other organizations doing. At Google, we have a specific retention and progression team, and Rachel Spivey, who leads that, she has a short video in the Diversity Annual Report that in the last year, we've doubled the number of resource in this particular team. And it's a team of individuals supporting people at Google. So people that are with us, and we want them to progress and we want to retain that talent. And this team of individuals supports people, Googlers, on their journeys, whether that's thinking about their next role or what's going to be right for them, providing coaching, guidance. And there is a Google keyword blog on retention and progression featuring Rachel as well. But it was something when I was looking at Google as a potential employer and looking at some of our representation data and thinking, questioning, there's not been much movement. Are they serious about this? Are they just talking about diversity? Or is it somewhere where I actually think we can make a difference? It was reading about the retention and progression team that really, I think, was one of my kind of attracting factors, because I hadn't seen anybody focus on retention and progression of existing talent. So really growing your existing talent in the same way that Google are doing. It's easy to talk about hiring and bringing in more women or more individuals from underrepresented groups, but what are they actually doing once that talent gets there? How are they supporting their talent and progressing their talent? So I think that's why that specific example is a really powerful one for me. And if anyone looks at our Diversity Annual Report, you'll read about it too and hopefully be inspired.
Well, we'll put it in the show notes so that people can access it easily. With your cumulative experience then, so we've got academia, we've got banking, we've got professional services and tech. Of all of that, so in anything you've come across in your diversity, equity, inclusion journey, what is the thing that the initiative or the work, aside from this, the retention and progression sounds amazing, but is there anything that's particularly resonated with you that thought, that's impressive, that has really pushed the dial on inclusion in this organisation?
Yeah, I think that the number one thing for me is, and the reason why I do this job and the reason I love it so much, is working with leaders to build their capability. So that is without a doubt the number one thing that I believe will shift the inclusion dial, not just at the macro level, which is obviously important, and we want to see organizations changing in terms of what we see and who we see, and is leadership more representative, and is there anyone that looks like me? So I think when you have leaders that are clear about their why for shifting the needle on diversity and building inclusive cultures, and we get that to have a ripple effect, we also start to see that micro experience shifting in terms of individuals in organization in their day-to-day feeling that difference. So are they feeling a change? Are they feeling a shift? And it's when those individuals at that micro level start to notice that there are people that look like them, or there are people that care, or there are people that are being curious, or if somebody's celebrating something specific, that their manager knows about it already and asks them, oh, I notice it's this, I hope you have a great time. Or if they're feeling included, regardless of their identity, not regardless of it, but because of it, they're celebrated. I think that for me is powerful. And that only happens with that overarching leadership buy-in, leadership understanding, and it being embedded into everyday experiences, everyday business decision making. So at Google, we also have some research that's featured in Harvard Business Review about our approach to product inclusion. And it's not always perfect, and we do get things wrong, but we're really trying to embed kind of what's our user experience in terms of the products that we're building, the influence that we have more broadly. And so that's where we have groups and individuals who provide those diverse experiences, points of view, thoughts. So when it's embedded into our day-to-day work, that's when we know, that's when for me as well, an organization, if they're thinking about DEI as a business as usual in terms of what they're doing as an organization, how they're living and breathing, how they're operating in terms of people management as a whole, as opposed to they have a D&I function and that D&I function will sort things out or create some initiatives. For me, it really is moving away from a D&I initiative into this is who we are, this is what we do, we're living it. And that really for me starts with that accountability piece and leader at the top.
For sure. The work that I'm doing with certain clients at the moment, there's a stepping stone for some organisations who, due to COVID, the organisation's taken a brutal hit, redundancies have had to happen and all that, and the leaders are just about surviving in terms of managing the workload. And so what I'm experiencing now at this moment in time is that leaders need so much support to get them to a point where they have capacity almost to overlay the accountability and responsibility and the lens on diversity, equity, inclusion, and to be a truly inclusive leader, because it takes effort. It isn't something that you can just do automatically by default, be inclusive. You have to know, you have to listen, you have to dedicate the time, you have to want to spend time reading, getting educated, listening to people. And I'm finding at the moment that this is a point where it's so critical that leaders focus on inclusion and better understand what it means to be an inclusive leader in order for the long-term sustainability of the organisation. And yet there's this firefighting going on and just about surviving sort of place where some of them are at, where you overlay, let's learn about being an inclusive leader, and they might just go like explode with just get with the overwhelm of it. So what would you say to that for organisations that are feeling overwhelmed, or leaders who are feeling overwhelmed at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's where the value, what is the long-term value of taking the time to focus on your leadership style? Because ultimately, as you say, you need to put in the effort. If you put in the effort, what will be the long-term value? What are the long-term gains that you get as a leader by taking an approach to mindful leadership, through taking an approach through inclusive leadership? What's the value you're going to get at a financial level in terms of productivity increase, innovation increase? So whatever sector you're in, we know that when leaders are inclusive and when they lead inclusively, we see an increase in innovation. We see an increase in productivity when individuals feel a sense of belonging. So it's those small mindful leadership moments that will ultimately, even though it may feel like effort and energy that you're putting in now, as with anything, it's like when we're studying and we have to put in the effort to get a qualification, we know the long-term impact and the long-term benefits are going to be greater. It's the same with continuing to work on yourself as a leader. So I think it's, as a leader, weighing up, well, if you just firefighting, you'll keep firefighting. If you put in the investment to pause and reflect, that's when you'll get greater value.
I'm with you. It's been an absolute pleasure, Rukasana. Thank you so much for your time. If anyone wants to get hold of you after listening to this podcast, where can they get hold of you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter, so usual platforms. More than happy to connect. And likewise, thank you so much for taking the time to talk this morning. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. So anything that Rukasana and I spoke about today is going to be available on the show notes page, which is the usual place, avaneerconsultingservices.com, under podcasts. I will catch up with you, no doubt, soon, Rukasana. All the best with everything you're doing at Google. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Nadia.
That concludes episode 17 of the Why Care podcast. Rukasana's words to demand more from your organisation has really stuck with me. She covered so much in this conversation, from race and faith inequity, microaggressions, women in tech, othering, cultural appropriation, and building leadership capability. Do let Rukasana and I know what you thought of today's show. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @Nadia Nagamutu and @Avaneer Consulting Services. As always, I really appreciate your support of this podcast through leaving a review on whatever platform you're listening and spreading the words by sharing it with your friends and family. Huge thanks to Maro Kenji for editing this podcast and to John Rice for supporting with the show notes and getting it out there on social media.